In today's video, I'll show you how I painted my most colorful mini yet, the RockGut Troggoth from Age of Sigmar, and his little friend who is about to receive a little love tap on his noggin. I did this one slightly differently than usual, and it actually might be my best mini yet, but I'll let you guys be the judges of that.
Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you're watching Fallon's Miniatures. So if you're interested in the process I used, the color choices I made plus the reasoning behind them, and of course in how I painted his purple skin on his belly, the turquoise crystals on his back, the greenish stone on his axe and the base, not to mention the green skin of the goblin and his orangish robes, then let's get painting.
But before we do, let's play a little game, because the most common question I receive on these paint jobs is how long it actually took me, and I'm usually very surprised about the estimates people give me. So once you watch this, do me a favor and go into the comments and comment with how long you think it actually took me, and after a couple of days I will come back and tell you, and it should be an interesting exercise. Alright, let's get painting.
First of all, I took a quick picture of the model under my desk lamp for later reference. With only the black primer on, the reflections of the lamp are a good guide on where I should put the highlights later. If you follow my videos, you probably know that my usual method of painting is to start from black or a colorful undertone and to do one element at a time while leaving everything else around it unpainted. Basically painting one thing at a time from 0 to 100 and then going for the next one. But this time I decided that I would change that up and do quite a bit of the work on the entire mini before starting the details and the highlights. So first I did a strong zenithal highlight for two reasons. One, it will create some natural transitions and highlight areas under my first base coat, and two, it will make the colors more vivid compared to painting them on a darker surface like black. Then it was time to paint in the two main elements which make up the majority of the surface of the model, the skin and the crystals that are growing out of his back, arms and legs. I was planning to use two colors that are always a great combination together, magenta or purple on the skin and something like turquoise on the crystals. So the plan was to block these in with the airbrush, since I don't have to care about overspray with these. They are quite light surfaces and I actually want to have some transition between them, so a bit of overspray is actually desirable. Then I could use the brush to paint in the rest of the base colors on the other things like his weapon, the clothes and the base and so forth. First I needed some dark colors that I could later use as shadows. For the skin I mixed some magenta with black to darken it down and sprayed that all over the skin. You can see that even though I went for full coverage, the parts over the white zenithal are still more bright and colorful. For the crystals I chose dark sea blue as the shadow color. It is a greenish bluish color which will work quite well in the shadows for turquoise.
Just keep in mind that none of these colors are actually our final shadows. Later on I will come in with a lot of different colors and I will add them into the shadows and the midtones. I'm just using these as a baseline to work from, but later I can modify them.
Now that I had my shadows established, I went further and started to go up in brightness, still using the airbrush. On the skin I sprayed a layer of pure magenta first, reinforcing the light placements from the zenithal, which also corresponded nicely with the photo I took earlier. And then I added some brown rose to the magenta to brighten it up, and because I wanted to highlight the skin towards a pinkish color. I sprayed this inside the previous magenta highlights, but still only roughly marking the highlights at this point. I wanted to bring the skin more or less to the halfway point in the highlighting process, so I would only need to do the last couple of stages by brush. Before I moved on to the crystals, I used the brush and some dark sea blue from my wet palette to make sure that the crystals are fully covered everywhere and to correct some of the overspray from the skin. I wanted to have some overspray, but the other way around. Some blues on the skin are fine, but the very light pinkish colors on the crystals not so much. This is a good example of why you should plan the order in which you apply the colors before you start spraying. If I started with the crystals, it would have been much more difficult to deal with the overspray. And now that all the colors were in the right places, I started highlighting the crystals with a mix of dark sea blue and turquoise. Just like with the skin, I was simply using this from a zenithal angle and trying to hit mostly the upper surfaces of the crystals, leaving the underside the original color. I decided to leave the crystals at this level of brightness and come back with the brush to finish the job later. I could have sprayed pure turquoise, but I thought it would brighten the upper surface too much and I would have trouble adding multiple highlights later without pushing the brightness too far.
At this point I had the two main colors ready to be highlighted by brush, but I also had to bring up the other elements to at least a base coat level as well. Unlike my usual method where I paint one element at a time, this will give us a better understanding of how the colors will look like on the model in the end.
First I corrected the overspray on the base a bit with dry brushing grimy grey on it. I was quite happy leaving some of the magenta in the shadows under the whitish highlights though. It will add some tones on the base, but it will be mostly covered by all the other colors I will be adding later. Then I used first some rattling grime covering the whole base and then some Crete camo from around the halfway point of the base, dragging it towards the bottom and creating a very basic transition. To be honest, at this point I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the base later, so I just added those colors as placeholders. You might also notice that I simply base coated the rock on his axe with dark sea blue as well, since similarly to the base I wasn't sure how it would end up in the end. Then I covered the handle of the axe with chocolate from AK Interactive. All the leather bits received a coat of whole red, and his loincloth got a mix of British khaki and black. I left the whole of the goblin completely black for now, since at this point I had absolutely no clue how he would end up in the end.
Alright, at this point the model was in a state where I made all the choices that I needed to make on the primary colors and they were ready to be highlighted. The rest of the elements were at least base coated, and I would have to make some choices about the secondary colors sooner or later, but first I wanted to see where I would end up with my main colors.
I started with highlighting the skin first, since even among the two main colors this will be the most visible from the main viewing angle from the front, and also the most complex one to paint from a process point of view. First I blocked in some brighter highlights in the middle of the last ones I created with the airbrush earlier. I used the same combination of magenta plus brown rose with maybe a little bit more brown rose in the mix. Colors usually end up looking much stronger when applied with the brush compared to an airbrush, so even though they are almost the same colors, the one applied with the brush will still stand out from the previous highlight. I also felt that I was lacking some brightness and color in the midtones, so I switched down one level back to magenta and created some darker highlights in the midtone areas as well. In both cases I created a strong well-covered highlight in the middle and then stippled in some small dots and scratches around them to make it easier to blend them with their surroundings. Once I was done, I first used magenta plus brown rose again through the airbrush, and with low pressure and high dilution I glazed over the stippling, integrating the new brush highlights into the previous airbrush ones. And then I did the same thing with the magenta highlights using a combination of magenta and violet through the airbrush. And why the violet? Because it is a great shadow color for purple and I wanted to sneak in more tones into the shadows. When everything was smooth on the skin, I went back to the brush and repeated the previous process, but this time with pure brown rose and on a smaller surface inside the previous highlight, leaving some of that color visible. These highlights might look quite harsh at this point, but we will tone them down a bit later on and there will be plenty of lighter colors around to make them seem less bright in comparison later. This time I only worked on the highlights without touching the midtones though. And once I was done with the brush, I switched to the airbrush again and used it to smooth everything out. For the next step I added some sunny and basic skin tone to the original brown rose. Initially I just wanted to go for the basic one, but I felt I needed a bit of yellow in there. This highlight was quite small and barely took any time at all to apply, and the same was true for the airbrush smoothing phase as well. The only difficulty here is not to overspray the previous colors with the airbrush, so if you feel like this is a bit too dangerous, you can also apply some glazes with the brush. And finally I stippled on some pure basic skin tone in the highest highlights to finish things off. The highlights were done, but the skin wasn't exactly finished yet. I wanted to make the colors a tad warmer since it turned out cooler than I imagined originally, and I wanted to introduce some more colors to make it more interesting. So first I loaded some diluted magenta into the airbrush and used it to bring back some color into the midtones, since I lost some of it in the highlighting process. This also helped with smoothing things out even further. Then I used one of my favorite colors, whole red, and sprayed it in some of the deeper shadows, especially under the belly where it can also look like it's a reflection of the loincloth, and also under the arms, under the chin, and so forth. This added a reddish tone onto the mini and made the shadows more interesting. Finally I loaded some laser yellow super diluted into the airbrush and sprayed it in between the highlights and the midtones. This added a little bit of yellowish greenish tone into the skin, making it feel warmer and more alive. Wherever I felt that I knocked back the highlights too much, I used some basic skin tone to re-establish them.
That is the skin done, so let's do the crystals next, and they are technically easier to paint, but they are also a wee bit tedious because there are so many of them.
Remember last time we touched the crystals, I finished them on a single highlight mix of dark sea blue and turquoise. And since there are so many details and each of them has a relatively small surface area, I won't need such a long color gradient with so many colors and so much smoothing with the airbrush like I did on the skin. So I immediately jumped to pure turquoise and I used the brush to highlight the majority of the surface on the top of the crystals. I tried to not fully cover the previous layer, especially in the shadow areas. I wasn't trying to perfectly edge highlight everything, that would take a lot of time, but I was trying to at least cover all the upper facing edges, even if a bit thickly, and a little bit of the down facing ones as well. Next I switched to blue-green and did the same thing, but this time I was concentrating more on the edges and used it even less in the shadow areas than the previous color. I was using the same big brush to speed things up, but I was doing my best to leave at least 20-30% of the previous color visible. Once I was done with this, and it took some time, I mixed in 50% pastel blue in my blue-green and highlighted only some few edges in the shadow areas and maybe like 50% of the surface in the light areas. I was trying to make my edge highlights thinner and to concentrate them on the edges most facing the light. Finally, I used pure pastel blue to highlight as thinly as possible the most visible edges and corners in the light areas and to add some small scratches here and there on the facets of the crystals that are facing the light. The highlights were done, but it was time to do the usual play with colors. First of all, the color of the crystals strayed too far into the blue tone, so I wanted to bring it back to a more bluish greenish tone and use the opportunity to do some smoothing as well. I used some fluorescent yellow for this, shooting it mostly from the top and especially in the areas that I imagined would be hit most by the light. And wherever I went too far, I used some pastel blue on the edges of the crystals to correct it a bit. Finally, I sprayed some violet mostly from below to add another tone and to darken the shadows a bit, but I also sprayed some of the areas that were in the shadows from the top, turning the highlights bluish to reinforce the idea that those areas are not hit by the light as much as the warmer yellowish green areas. And at this point I also realized that I forgot to paint the warts that this beautiful gentleman has all around his skin, so I quickly rectified it by using Nasdaq yellow contrast paint, and with that the two main colors were mostly done.
Now I had to make some choices about the secondary colors I would use on the model. They might not be as important as the main ones, but choosing the right ones can really elevate the paint job, or, well, the opposite if you choose the wrong ones.
But before I made big decisions about the base, the axe or the goblin, I wanted to paint in the eyes. The one facing us is very important and one of the first things the viewer will look at, so I had to put in some effort. I left the whole eye socket black and used the same grimy grey I already had on my wet palette from correcting the base earlier to paint in the eyeball. A grey color is perfect for this, since pure white would stand out from the face too much. I made sure I had full coverage, and then I used some very diluted red paint to glaze in some red around the eyeball, covering a bit less than half the white or so. Maybe he didn't get enough sleep last night, or maybe the eyes of trolls are always bloodshot, I don't know, but it looks pretty good. Then with some turquoise I painted in the iris. I had to correct it a couple of times with some grey to make it more or less perfectly round. Initially I added a blue-green pupil and then a small dot of pure white to represent the light glinting on the shiny surface of the eye. But later I replaced the blue-green with a black dot for the pupil, which looked much more natural. The three most important things on the model other than the skin and the crystals were the base, the head of the axe, and the little goblin about to meet an untimely end in the Troggoth's hand. But before we get to the base, let me show you a quick montage of the rest of the elements, which are not as front and center but still have an impact on the end result. I will put the colors I use for them on the screen.
Okay, let's talk about the head of the axe and the base.
I decided to make those two basically the same color, the idea being that the troll simply took a piece of stone off the ground, and since I still felt that the whole composition was lacking something, I decided to use some colors that would play nicely with both the skin and the crystals. I painted the axe head first, highlighting it up from anthracite grey to emerald to grass green and all the way up to pistachio, which is effectively a yellow. When I was done, I took the airbrush, smoothed out the yellow highlights with some thinned down laser yellow, and to make the transitions on the stone even more dramatic, I sprayed violet from below. This is a great complementary color to yellow and green, so it ended up looking super colorful. Then I did the same thing with the base, but using some simple dry brushing, which did the job quite admirably. It doesn't look as good as the axe head, but it is the base, so it doesn't have to be as cool. The last thing to figure out was the goblin, and I was fairly sure that I wanted him to be a proper green goblin dude, so that part was easy. I highlighted him up from dark green to deep green, and then light green, and finally interior yellow. Then I added some skin tones on his lips, knuckles, and so forth to make him a bit more interesting and not just green. But I didn't know what to do with the robes on the little guy. I could have just left him black with some basic grey highlights, but that just felt wrong on a colorful paint job like this, and I was at a loss, to be honest, so I did what every reasonable man does in a situation like this, and I asked my wife. And after brief consideration, she said orange, so orange he became. And I went with an orange scheme that could also be interpreted as a type of leather, starting from whole red and then going into Kalahari orange, Mars orange, and finally some ice yellow. And with that, the model was finished, and the end result looks like this.
Don't forget to tell me how long you think it took me to paint this one. I'm really curious about your guesstimations. Thank you very much for watching, and if you made it this far, you probably enjoyed the video, so why not give it a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next one.